Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside with your coffee, and finding a fine from your HOA for parking in your own garage. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And let me tell you, this wasn't just about a parking violation. This was about power, control, and one entitled HOA Karen who thought she could run the entire neighborhood like her personal kingdom. But she had no idea who she was messing with. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would end up in an HOA horror story. I mean, sure, I knew HOAs could be annoying. I'd heard all the stories. People being fined for the color of their curtains, being told their mailbox wasn't the right shade of beige, even getting warnings for having unauthorized plants in their own garden. But I figured as long as I followed the basic rules, I'd be fine. Boy, was I wrong. It all started on an ordinary morning. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, enjoying the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. The air was crisp. The sun was just starting to warm up the pavement. And for a moment, everything felt perfect. That was until I glanced at my mailbox and saw the dreaded white envelope sitting there. Now, if you live in an HOA, you know nothing good ever comes in a white envelope. With a sigh, I grabbed the letter, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense they were about to throw at me this time. Maybe a warning about my trash cans not being perfectly aligned with the curb. Maybe a complaint about the wind chimes on my porch being too loud. But when I opened it and saw the words, violation notice, improper parking, I had to do a double take. Improper parking? In my own garage? At first, I thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe they sent this to the wrong house. Maybe they meant to find someone else. But no, right there, in big, bold letters, was my address. And just below that, a $100 fine for violating HOA community parking regulations. I read it again and again, but no matter how many times I looked at it, it still didn't make any sense. According to the notice, garages in the neighborhood were not considered approved parking spaces under the HOA's community uniformity guidelines. Hold up. Let's break that down for a second. They were trying to tell me that parking my car in my own garage was against the rules? This had to be a joke. I flipped the paper over, searching for some kind of logical explanation. And there it was, in the tiniest, most bureaucratic print possible. All garages must remain clear of vehicles to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. I blinked, read it again, and then did what any sane person would do in this situation. I laughed out loud, because surely, this was some kind of prank. But then I saw the name at the bottom of the letter, Karen. Oh yes, that Karen. Every HOA has one. The self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, the person who takes their volunteer position way too seriously, the one who walks around with a clipboard, just waiting to bust someone for leaving their trash bin out 5 minutes past pickup time. In my neighborhood, Karen wasn't just on the HOA board. She practically was the HOA. She was the type to send out a mass email about someone's grass being too green, the type to measure holiday decorations with a ruler to make sure they didn't exceed community standards, and apparently, the type to invent completely ridiculous parking rules just so she could slap me with a fine. I took a deep breath, trying to process what I was looking at. This couldn't be real. First of all, how does an empty garage make a neighborhood look better? Second, why was I the only one getting this fine? I glanced outside, scanning my street. I saw at least 3 other neighbors who had their cars parked inside their garages, just like I did. Their garage doors were wide open, revealing everything from SUVs to motorcycles to full-on storage units. But somehow, I was the one getting fined. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics. This was about Karen. She had been trying to push me around for months now. First, she left a warning on my door about my patio furniture being non-compliant. Then she tried to tell me my mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Spoiler, it was the exact same color as everyone else's. But this was her boldest move yet. And that's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was making them up as she went along. Because, let's be real, no one in their right mind writes a rule saying you can't park a car in your own garage. I felt a slow burn of anger bubbling up in my chest. I wasn't just going to roll over and accept this nonsense. I was going to fight back. But before I did anything, I needed to confirm something. Was I the only one dealing with this? Or was Karen pulling this on other people too? I grabbed my phone and started texting a few of my neighbors. Had anyone else gotten a fine for this nonsense? Was Karen on another one of her HOA power trips? It didn't take long for my phone to start buzzing. Wait, what? You got fined for parking in your own garage? That's insane. I've been parking in mine for years. Never got a notice. Karen's at it again. She tried to get me for unauthorized decorations last Christmas. Total power trip. And just like that, I had my answer. This wasn't about parking. This was personal. Karen had been waiting for an excuse to come after me, and now she thought she had found one. Well, if she thought I was just going to hand over $100 and let her walk all over me, she was in for a rude awakening, because I wasn't just going to ignore this fine. I was going to take her and the entire HOA down with it. I wasn't about to let this slide. A fine for parking in my own garage? That was beyond ridiculous. I knew Karen had a habit of overstepping her HOA authority, but this time, she had really outdone herself. I grabbed my phone, took a picture of the violation notice, and stared at it for a second. The longer I looked at it, the more my frustration grew. It wasn't just the fine itself. It was the audacity of it all. The way Karen thought she could make up rules as she went. The way she probably smirked to herself while writing this nonsense up, thinking I'd just roll over and pay it like some scared HOA newbie. Yeah, not happening. I wasn't sure what my next move was yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I needed answers. Karen lived 3 houses down from me in what she probably considered her personal kingdom. You know the type. Perfectly manicured lawn, not a single blade of grass out of place, wind chimes that somehow never made a sound, and an HOA-approved color scheme that screamed boring. I walked up to her door, the violation notice still clutched in my hand, and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to leave when suddenly I heard the sound of blinds shifting. Oh, she was home. She just wasn't answering. Classic. I knew Karen was the kind of person who loved dishing out HOA citations, but absolutely hated when people called her out on them. She probably figured if she ignored me long enough, I'd just give up and go away. Wrong. Karen, I called out, making sure my voice was loud enough to be heard through the door. I know you're in there. I just have a quick question about this fine you sent me. Silence. Then, after a few painfully long seconds, I heard the deadbolt click. The door creaked open just a few inches. Not enough to invite conversation, but just enough to assert control. Karen stood there, arms crossed, lips pursed like she had just sucked on a lemon. She was dressed in her usual HOA queen attire, an ironed polo shirt, probably with board member embroidered on the back, beige slacks, and an expression that said, "I live to make your life difficult." "Yes," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. "What can I do for you?" I held up the violation notice. "This," I said, pointing at it. "You fined me for parking in my garage. My own garage. I just want to understand how that's even a rule." Karen sighed dramatically, like I was wasting her precious time. "It's in the community guidelines," she said flatly. "Garages must remain clear of vehicles to maintain neighborhood aesthetics." I blinked. "That makes no sense," I said, my patience already running thin. "Garages are literally made for parking. If anything, keeping a car inside looks better than having it out in the driveway." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell she wasn't used to people challenging her HOA gospel. "That's not how our community operates," she said curtly. "This neighborhood has standards." "Oh, here we go." I crossed my arms. "Really?" Because I just took a walk down the street, and I saw at least 3 people with cars parked in their garages. And last time I checked, no one was getting fined for it. Karen's eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. She knew she was targeting me. "This is not up for discussion," she said, her voice getting sharper. "You received a violation notice. You have until the end of the month to pay the fine." Oh, she thought this was over. She thought she could just dictate a ridiculous rule, throw a fine at me and walk away. Nope, not today. I stepped forward slightly, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Karen," I said, "you can't just make up rules and expect people to follow them." Her face twitched. "I don't make up rules." "Then show me," I said. "Show me exactly where in the HOA bylaws it says I can't park in my own garage." She hesitated, and that's when I knew she was bluffing. There was no rule. This wasn't about community guidelines. This was personal. Karen had a problem with me, and she thought she could use her HOA position to push me around. Not gonna happen. I wasn't going to get anywhere with Karen, at least not directly. If she was this determined to play HOA dictator, I needed to take a different approach. So, I did the one thing Karen probably never expected. I gathered the neighbors. Within an hour, I had texts from half a dozen people in the community who were just as fed up as I was. "She fined you for parking in your garage? That's ridiculous. Karen's been doing this for years. She just picks random people to harass. She tried to fine me for unauthorized patio furniture last summer. It's a power trip." That was all I needed to hear. Karen wasn't just a problem for me. She was a problem for the entire neighborhood. I had a plan, and if Karen thought she could just fine me into submission, she was about to find out exactly who she was messing with. Karen had no idea what she had started. Fining me for parking in my own garage was one thing, but the more I looked into it, the more it became obvious. This wasn't just some isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a very shady, very deliberate pattern of the HOA stretching the rules, twisting them, and using them as a weapon to control homeowners. And I wasn't going to let it slide. The first thing I did was get my hands on every HOA document I could find. I spent hours poring over the rules, looking for anything that even remotely justified Karen's fine. But instead of finding a clear answer, all I found was ambiguity, pages upon pages of vague language, loosely defined regulations, and enough gray areas to give Karen all the power she needed to enforce whatever rules she wanted. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about following HOA rules. This was about power. Karen and her little clique on the board weren't just enforcing community standards. They were using their authority to pick and choose who got fined, what counted as a violation, and who had to suffer under their ridiculous decisions. That's when I knew I wasn't just going to fight my fine. I was going to expose the entire corrupt system. I started talking to neighbors. Some of them had already told me their stories, like Greg, who got fined for his patio bench, and Lisa, whose holiday wreath apparently offended the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. But as I dug deeper, I realized there were way more victims than I thought. One guy told me he got fined for having his trash cans out a few minutes past the pickup time, even though they were still on his property. Another woman got a letter demanding she trim her bushes to an approved height, even though there was no actual rule stating what that height was. And then there was the couple down the street who got a $500 violation because their front door was painted a shade too dark, despite the fact that no one had ever given them a specific color requirement to follow. The stories just kept coming. But the worst part, anytime someone questioned a fine, they were met with the same response: either pay up or be prepared for more violations to follow. That's when I knew this wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about fear. Karen and the HOA were running a system that thrived on intimidation. They knew most people didn't have the time, patience, or legal knowledge to fight back, so they counted on homeowners just giving up and paying the fines to avoid further trouble. I decided I wasn't going to be one of those people. I wasn't just going to argue about my fine. I was going to force the HOA to answer for everything they had been doing. The next board meeting was coming up in a week. Normally, those meetings were empty, maybe 5 or 6 people in attendance, all of them either HOA members or the same few homeowners who wanted to stay on Karen's good side. I was about to change that. I started spreading the word. I talked to every homeowner I could, telling them exactly what I had found. I printed copies of the most ridiculous fines and passed them around the neighborhood. I even made a flyer listing all the unjust violations homeowners had received under Karen's rule. People were pissed. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, it was like a mini revolution. Instead of the usual half-empty room, we had dozens of homeowners showing up, most of them holding copies of their own violations in hand. Karen, who had clearly expected another easy, uneventful meeting, looked visibly nervous the moment she walked in and saw the crowd. The second the floor opened for discussion, I stood up. "I'd like to address a serious issue regarding HOA violations," I said, holding up my fine for everyone to see. Specifically, the fact that I was fined for parking inside my own garage, and I'm not the only one dealing with these kinds of absurd rules. The room was dead silent. All eyes were on me. I glanced at Karen, who was already shifting uncomfortably in her seat. She didn't like where this was going. "I've read the HOA rulebook cover to cover," I continued, "and nowhere does it say that parking in my own garage is a violation. Yet I was fined. Why?" Karen cleared her throat and tried to put on her usual authoritative tone. "The HOA has the right to enforce parking standards for the good of the community," she said. "Garages are meant to be used for vehicle storage." "Yes, I've read the guidelines," I interrupted, "but nowhere does it say that homeowners can't park in them." So I asked again, why was I fined? She didn't have an answer, and the moment I saw that hesitation in her eyes, I knew I had her cornered. I turned to the rest of the room. "I'm not the only one who's been targeted by vague, inconsistent, and unfair HOA fines," I said. "Many of us in this room have, and I have proof." I started reading off the violations I had collected. Greg got fined for a bench. Lisa got fined for a holiday wreath. Mike got a $500 fine because his front door was too dark. More and more homeowners started speaking up, confirming their own experiences. Karen tried to regain control, insisting that every fine was issued fairly. But by now, no one was buying it. The room had turned against her. The more she tried to explain herself, the more obvious it became she had no real justification for any of it. The HOA board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. They hadn't expected this level of pushback. They weren't used to people actually holding them accountable. And for the first time since this ridiculous battle started, Karen was losing control. Karen's face was turning red, not the usual shade of mild annoyance she wore when she was throwing around her HOA authority. This was full-blown rage, the kind of rage that happens when someone who's used to being in control suddenly realizes they're losing. She had walked into the HOA meeting expecting business as usual, handing out violations, brushing off complaints, and making homeowners feel powerless. But tonight was different. I had called her bluff, and the entire neighborhood was watching. As more people spoke up about their unfair fines, Karen's attempts to defend herself became more desperate. She tried the official policy excuse. That failed. She tried the "we're just enforcing community standards" excuse. That failed too. Then she resorted to the classic power move, talking over people, shutting down discussions, and attempting to regain control through sheer intimidation. But nobody was having it, and that's when I saw it. The exact moment Karen snapped. With a dramatic huff, she grabbed the microphone and glared directly at me. "This meeting is getting out of hand," she said through gritted teeth, "and I won't tolerate this level of disrespect." Disrespect? I almost laughed. Disrespect was her fining people for nonsense rules she made up on the spot. Disrespect was bullying homeowners into silence and scaring them into paying up. But now that the tables were turned, she suddenly couldn't handle it. She turned to one of the board members, a man who had barely spoken all night and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. "Call security," she snapped. "Now." For a second, the entire room went silent, and then chaos. "Security!" someone shouted from the back. "For what?" another homeowner asked. "This is ridiculous." Karen ignored everyone, standing there like a queen demanding her royal guards to drag me away. I folded my arms and looked her dead in the eyes. "On what grounds?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She hesitated. She hadn't expected me to challenge her directly. "This meeting has become disruptive," she said, her voice shaking. "You're inciting people against the HOA, and that is completely unacceptable." I let out a short laugh. "I'm not inciting anything, Karen. I'm holding you accountable." More voices chimed in. "He's right. We're just asking for fairness. This is our community, not your personal kingdom." Karen's frustration boiled over. "You're all in violation of the HOA's meeting conduct rules," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "If you don't like how things are done here, you can leave this community." And there it was, the moment she exposed her true mindset. She didn't see herself as a representative of the homeowners. She saw herself as a ruler, a dictator, the ultimate authority who could do whatever she wanted. And if you didn't like it, too bad. But now, nobody feared her anymore. A few people actually laughed at her outburst. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Even the other board members looked uncomfortable, realizing Karen had completely lost control. And then, as if to prove just how far gone she was, she did the unthinkable. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she announced. "For what?" "For questioning HOA fines, for speaking at an open meeting, for standing up against unfair treatment." The sheer ridiculousness of it all had people whispering, some outraged, some just plain amused. "This is insane," someone muttered. "She's really calling the cops?" another whispered. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting her dig her own grave. She put the phone to her ear, turned away slightly, and started talking. "Yes, I need officers at neighborhood name HOA board meeting," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "There's a disruptive individual refusing to leave, and we feel unsafe." Unsafe? That was rich. She was calling the police on me because I had the audacity to question her authority, because she couldn't handle being exposed. It was the ultimate Karen move. I could already picture how that 911 call was going. "Operator, what's the emergency?" "Karen, a man is standing in a meeting, asking questions, and holding a piece of paper. Send backup immediately." The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on the homeowners. Someone snorted. "She really thinks the police are going to show up and arrest him for talking?" Another person rolled their eyes. "What? Is questioning an HOA now a felony?" The tension in the room shifted. People weren't just frustrated anymore. They were angry, not just at Karen, but at the entire power-hungry HOA system that allowed this nonsense to happen. It wasn't just me who had been wronged. It was all of us. And now, Karen had just ensured that the entire neighborhood was against her. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen had just made the ultimate fool of herself, calling the cops on me for daring to question her authority. And now, she was standing there, phone in hand, waiting for her saviors to show up and remove me like some kind of criminal. But there was just one tiny problem with her plan. The cops never came. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People exchanged looks, some smirking, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen kept glancing at the door, expecting a grand entrance of officers ready to drag me out in handcuffs. But nothing happened. And that's when she really started to panic. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that she had overplayed her hand, that she had exposed herself, not just as a petty HOA tyrant, but as a full-blown, power-hungry control freak who had lost all credibility. I leaned against the table, arms crossed, and just waited. And then, like an unintentional gift from the universe, Karen's phone rang, loud. She jumped, scrambling to answer. Yes? Hello? Everyone in the room fell silent. We couldn't hear what the officer on the other end was saying, but we could hear Karen's stammering response. Well, yes, he's still here. Yes, at the meeting, but... She turned to glance at me, her expression darkening. He's refusing to leave. She went quiet for a second, then her face fell. A few people chuckled. Whatever the officer had just told her, it was not what she wanted to hear. No, this is an HOA matter, she insisted, her voice getting higher. He's disrupting the meeting. We feel unsafe. More silence. Then, the final nail in Karen's coffin. Her face twisted in frustration, and she let out a sharp sigh. Fine, she snapped before hanging up. She turned back to me, but now she was the one looking defeated. The police, I said, keeping my voice casual. Aren't coming, are they? Karen clenched her jaw. They said it's a civil matter. Bingo. The room erupted. Laughter. Cheers. Someone even clapped. This was it. The moment everyone had been waiting for. Karen had officially lost, and she knew it. Her power, her authority, her iron grip over this community, gone in an instant. She tried to salvage what little dignity she had left. This meeting is over, she barked, grabbing her things. We'll, be sending notices about this later. Notices, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. For what? For daring to stand up to you? She ignored me, storming toward the door, her face burning with embarrassment. But before she could escape, a voice from the back called out, "We're voting to remove her." Silence. Karen froze mid-step. I turned to see who had spoken. It was one of the homeowners, a woman who had kept quiet the entire night. But now she looked determined. We can call an emergency vote, she continued. Right now, we have enough homeowners here. We can remove her from the HOA board. Karen whipped around. You can't do that. Oh, but we can, I said, smirking. It's in the bylaws. Her face went pale. One by one, hands shot up in the air. All in favor of removing Karen from her position? The woman asked. Nearly every single hand in the room went up. Karen's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but what could she say? The people had spoken. Her reign was over. You can't. She started, but her voice cracked. She looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. No one did. With a choked sound, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. And just like that, Karen was gone. A cheer erupted. Someone high-fived me. People were laughing, shaking their heads, celebrating. For the first time in years, we felt free. The HOA had been a nightmare for so long, but tonight, we had won. Not just for me, but for every single person who had ever been bullied by Karen's ridiculous rules and fake fines. Walking out of that meeting, I felt lighter, victorious. And as I stepped into my car, parked in my own garage, where it had always belonged, I couldn't help but smile. The HOA got their reality check. Karen got exactly what she deserved. And me, I got the last laugh.